So for many years he was a mainstay, not only with the Muncie magazines, but then later at Street and Smith, where he was the most prolific writer for Western Story magazine, which we'll discuss later on. Here's a magazine called Adventure. Adventure started in 1910, and it was considered the dean of the pulp magazines. It was always a cut above the others. Many pulp magazines, especially into the 20s and 30s, when competition was fierce, went increasingly toward the lurid and the garish, not only in the quality of the fiction, but also in the artwork of their covers. Adventure always maintained a classy outlook. They had the best writers of adventure fiction, including Talbot Mundy, whose big hits included King of the Khyber Rifles and a series of stories about Jim Grimm, an adventurer in the Middle East. Harold Lamb, who wrote great historical stories about the Crusades and also wrote about Cossacks. W.C. Tuttle, who was the son of a Montana sheriff, an authentic Westerner, who wrote stories of range detective Hash Knife Hartley. Adventure had the best writers consistently. It is, to this day, among people who collect pulp magazines, probably the most desirable pulp. It's a very difficult feat to assemble a complete set of Adventure, although there is a man in this room who has done so. It's still an extremely classy magazine, and its peak years were the 20s, when it was edited by a man named Arthur Sullivan Hoffman, who was someone who insisted on some literary quality in the stories. He admired people like Joseph Conrad, and he constantly encouraged his writers to eschew the typical pulp formulas and go after something else. And as a consequence, you had many writers for Adventure who were not only historians and great storytellers, but in many cases adventurers themselves. Many of the contributors to Adventure actually wrote about areas and events with which they were personally familiar. A man named Arthur O'Friel, for example, wrote many great stories about South America, and especially adventure stories along the Orinoco River. Well, he was familiar with that area. He was familiar with the natives, the customs, some of the events, the historical background, the influence of the Spanish explorers in that area. So he was able to create stories that were not only thrilling and to a certain extent melodramatic, they satisfied the reader's quest for vicarious excitement, but he was also able to do so with an air of verisimilitude that in other words, he was really able to capture the flavor of the area and the locale and the people who lived there. Short Stories was another great magazine, not quite as as I would say, not quite as good as Adventure in terms of literary quality of its stories, but a very solid, unpretentious magazine that specialized in good, solid adventure fiction. Unlike many pulp magazines, Short Stories never dabbled in anything that was outre in terms of plot elements. They avoided sex scrupulously. They stayed away from stories of the fantastic or the occult. For the most part, there were occasional exceptions. For example, Sax Rohmer, who wrote the Fu Manchu stories, did write some stories involving Oriental mysticism that he sold to Short Stories. Short Stories actually began as a literary magazine, and it published stories by people like Jack London that were of a much higher quality than the typical pulp fare. But by 1910, they were taken over by Doubleday, which is a book publisher in New York, and Doubleday made it more of a traditional pulp. But again, throughout its existence, Short Stories competed with Adventure. They went after a higher-end clientele. They stayed away from sleazy stuff, and even though they ran fiction, most of the most popular genres, the straight adventure story, detective story, or the Western story, they managed to maintain a pretty classy demeanor for most of its time.
Was their clientele mostly adult men, I assume, but
yeah,
adult?
You know, interestingly, in the early years, the pulp magazines actually had a family audience. I mean, Muncie, with the Argosy and with All Story, if you read the magazines now, you will find stories that appeal to female as well as male readers. It was not always stories of blood and thunder adventure. In fact, in All Stories, you'll find a lot of short stories that are, little domestic dramas, squabbles between husbands and wives, and, stories about big city office drones, are tired of commuting, and, there's all kinds of
Oh, I guess
situations.
there were romance pulps too, weren't there?
Yes, I'll get into those. Yeah, there were, that was a whole offshoot. But in the beginning, the field was dominated by these magazines that tried to be all things to all people. Later on, especially after World War I, into the 20s, there was a trend towards specialization, where you found more magazines devoted to specific genres, which I'll get into. Another one of the big ones was Street Smith's Popular magazine. This was another magazine that had a great pedigree because its editor was a man named Charles Agnew McLean, who's considered one of the great fiction editors. He published in Popular some of the best authors of the period, including, by the way, people who are not necessarily known for pulp work, including Jack London and B.M. Bauer, who created Chick of the Flying U stories, and Rex Beach, who did stories of the Alaskan wilderness and the Yukon. Popular was considered a very classic magazine, just a notch below Argosy and All Story. And again, they catered initially to a family clientele. Gradually, throughout the 20s, they shifted towards more of a male readership. I think it is, although it's often been said that the pulp magazines appealed to working class, blue-collar type readers, not terribly well educated, I think that's a mistake, and it's something, it's a description that's commonly attributed, a reader, I should say, that's commonly attributed to the more garish, more lurid pulps of the 20s and 30s, where clearly the quality of the fiction was not as high, and you had publishers resorting to rather outrageous themes and storytelling techniques to try to appeal to different readers. But in the early days, in the teens and early 20s, the pulps were, I think, a lot classier than most would give credit for. Another early Street Smith magazine, Top Notch, this grew out of one of the dime novel nickel weekly type publications. This, as you can see in this cover, you've got two fishermen. This was a magazine that was heavily geared towards stories, sports stories and stories of outdoorsmen. It was not, I don't think, a terribly exciting pulp. I mean, I have quite a few of these. I've yet to read one that really excited me. But it was very solid in its own way, and it did appeal to a certain niche. And it demonstrated, once again, that Street Smith was a company that early on developed what it believed to be very consistent marketable formulas, and they stayed with them pretty much throughout their existence. Another of the Street Smith publications was Wild West Weekly. This was something else that began as one of the nickel weeklies. It was actually published by a competitor of Street Smith, a guy named Frank Tousi. When Tousi passed away, Wild West Weekly was sold to Street Smith, which of course was delighted to get it. At that point, they changed it from the nickel weekly format into a bona fide pulp magazine, which is a process that took them a couple of years. It was a gradual evolution. Wild West Weekly was kind of a juvenile magazine. In the first place, it represented a trend that began in the 20s towards all Western pulps. The Western probably was the most popular genre in terms of number of different pulps and number of stories published, especially throughout the 20s and 30s. This went along with a general increase in the desirability of Western themes in popular novels such as those of Zane Grey, and also in movies. The 20s was the heyday of the Western movie star, Tom Mix, William S. Hart, Ken Maynard, people like that. So the Wild West Weekly were pretty much wild and woolly adventure stories. They were written on a more juvenile level, and nonetheless, they attracted a very loyal readership. And to this day, of all the Western pulps, Wild West Weekly, I would say, despite the juvenile nature of its fiction, is probably of the Western pulps the most feverishly collected among people who really specialize in Western pulps. Although there were some other great ones.